Let's talk about something that's probably confusing a lot of you right now. I mean, you look at the news, and then you look at your investment portfolio, and it feels like they're from two different planets, right? The headlines are all doom and gloom, but the markets, they're soaring. So we're going to dig into what is really going on behind this huge disconnect.
Okay, so on one side, you've got the news tape. It's just a constant stream of tariff wars, scary geopolitical conflicts, and political chaos. It's enough to make anybody want to hide their money under the mattress. But then you look at the market tape, and it's telling a totally different story. Stocks are at all-time highs, and corporate bond spreads, which is just a fancy way of saying how much extra it costs companies to borrow money versus the government, they're super tight. That signals massive confidence. It just doesn't add up.
Which brings us to the big question. The one we're going to try to answer today. How can both of these realities exist at the same time? What on earth is propping up the market when everything else seems so shaky?
Well, the answer isn't that investors are just, plugging their ears and ignoring all the bad news. No, it's that there's this enormous coordinated effort happening behind the scenes to fight it. You could almost say we're in the middle of a global policy party.
And this party is being fueled by a really powerful cocktail. It's got two main ingredients. First, you have government spending money like there's no tomorrow. And second, you've got central banks pushing interest rates down, making it incredibly cheap to borrow. You put those two together and wow, that's a huge tailwind for financial markets.
And I mean, the sheer scale of this spending is, well, it's just jaw-dropping. Take Germany, for example. These guys are famous for being careful with their money, right? Well, they've just launched a new stimulus plan worth 500 billion euros. To put that in perspective, that's 12% of their entire country's economy.
And hey, this isn't just a European thing, not by a long shot. Over in the US, President Trump's latest tax bill is set to add another $3.4 trillion to the national deficit over the next 10 years. The strategy is pretty clear. If you see a slowdown coming, just try to spend your way out of it.
So let's just break this down for a second, because it's super important. There are two big levers being pulled here. You've got fiscal policy, that's the politicians. They spend more and they tax less. Then you've got monetary policy, that's the central bankers. They cut interest rates. The key thing to understand is that right now, both of these powerful levers are being pulled in the exact same direction, full speed ahead on stimulus.
But you know how every great party has that one risk? The one thing that could just bring the whole thing to a screeching halt? Well, for this policy party, there's a very specific and very scary party crasher that everyone's worried about, and its name is inflation.
As Karen Ward from JP Morgan Asset Management puts it so well, inflation is the one thing that can truly spoil the fun. See, all this spending and cheap money doesn't fix inflation. In fact, it's the very thing that can make it a whole lot worse.
And we don't even have to look that far back to see what happens when inflation gets out of control. Remember 2022? When inflation spiked, it totally broke the old rules of investing. For decades, the idea was that if stocks went down, your bonds would go up and protect you. But in 2022, they both fell at the same time, leaving investors completely exposed.
So if the politicians and the central bankers aren't going to stop the party, who is? Who holds them accountable? Well, there's this old, powerful force in the financial markets that's starting to wake up again. You can think of them as the market's enforcers.
They're called bond vigilantes. It's this awesome old-school term for the big, powerful investors in the bond market. If they think a government is being reckless with its spending and is going to cause inflation, they basically protest by dumping that country's bonds. That forces the government's borrowing costs to go way up, and it's a very real form of discipline.
And if you want a perfect, almost unbelievable example of this in action, you just have to look at what happened in the UK back in 2022. The new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, announced these massive tax cuts with absolutely no plan to pay for them. The bond vigilantes went ballistic. They sold UK bonds like crazy, and the country's borrowing costs went through the roof. The whole crisis was so fast and so brutal that a British newspaper set up a live stream to see if she would last longer than a head of lettuce. The lettuce won. She was out in 49 days. That's the power of the bond market. And what that story really shows is this vicious cycle that some economists call the doom loop. It starts when a government's deficit gets too high. That makes investors nervous, so they start selling bonds. That causes yields, the interest rates, to spike. Now it's way more expensive for the government to borrow money, which, you guessed it, makes the deficit even worse. It can spiral out of control really fast.
Now, it's really tempting to look at that whole Liz Truss thing and think, oh, that's just a crazy British problem. But it's not. The exact same pressures that blew up her government are building right now in pretty much every major Western economy. This isn't a UK problem. It's a global warning shot.
I mean, just look across Europe right now. The UK is still trying to figure out how to plug a massive hole in its budget. In France, the political situation is a mess, with 3 governments falling apart because of fights over spending. And even powerhouse Germany is expected to see its debt balloon as it finally starts spending more on its military. Everywhere you look, politicians' promises are slamming up against market realities.
And just to prove that no one is immune, not even the biggest economy in the world, in May of 2025, the credit rating agency Moody's actually stripped the United States of its top-tier perfect credit score. And the reason they gave? Growing fears over America's absolutely massive national debt. Okay, so all of this brings us back to the big question for you, for us, for any investor out there. With government spending with both hands and the threat of inflation lurking in the background, what does this all mean for how you manage your money? It creates a huge dilemma.
This really gets to the heart of the problem for, the average investor. The classic 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds. That's worked great for decades, but it only works in a world with low inflation. Like we saw in 2022, when inflation gets high, that beautiful relationship breaks down. Both stocks and bonds can fall at the exact same time. And that cushion you thought you had, it's just gone.
So if the old playbook, the one we've relied on for decades, is broken, then what do? Where can you actually find protection for your money? What kind of assets can actually help you when inflation comes and crashes the party? Well, the thinking is, you might have to look outside the usual places, beyond the public stock and bond markets. The real protection might be found in private, real assets. We're talking about physical things like airplanes and cargo ships, or core infrastructure projects like toll roads and airports. Even something like timber. These are tangible assets that tend to hold their value when paper money is losing its own.
So here's where we land. The policy party is absolutely in full swing right now, and it's pushing markets to incredible highs. It feels great. But if there's one lesson from financial history, it's this. The bill for the party, it always comes due, sooner or later. So the real question you have to ask yourself is, when that hangover finally arrives, is your portfolio going to be ready for it?